All right, hi everyone. I know some of you. I'm Eric Lane. I am the bow maker at Rooning and Son Violins in Boston. I've been there 18 years this fall. Most of my day is restoration, repair, rehair, that sort of thing. I do get some making done. Some of these are mine, but my expertise, I would say, is in the restoration field these days. Why don't we go one by one, since I don't know all of you? Just give a brief introduction. Anthony.
Sure. So yeah, my name's Anthony. I go by Tony or Anthony. I worked for a shop for about 15 years up here in the Detroit area, and a couple years ago I just went out on my own. I've been focusing on just bow making. I did mostly restoration work, repair work, as much as you can restore a bow. Work for 15 years, and then in 2015 I really got into bow making, and I've kind of just been pursuing that and just been working on my own up here. So.
Aitan, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, that's me. I studied music actually in Amsterdam. So I play violin, a Baroque violin and lute. And 15 years ago, I started making historical bows. So I make only historical bows, Baroque and transitional bows. And I actually don't do repairs because I feel you need a training for that, and it's I wouldn't take the responsibility. But I'm interested.
And are you still in Amsterdam?
Yeah. No, I live in Israel now. In Israel, yeah.
Okay, great. Alessandra.
Hi, I'm here in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I'm more a restorer than a maker. I want to go back to making because I couldn't do this for years because I had problems with my shoulder and other things, so I couldn't make. And I do e-hairs and these kind of things.
Okay. Josh.
I'm Josh Henry, and I live in Charlestown, West Virginia, about 1 hour outside of the craziness of Washington, D.C. But most of my career, I've considered myself to be more of a restorer than a maker. A lot of years doing lots of rehairs, seeing some really fine bows across my workbench, stuff like that. Been sort of that internal frustration battle of making a living doing repairs, wanting to make a living doing making, trying to match that up. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
All right. Tyler.
I'm Tyler, and I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and I've got a similar story to Anthony, where I've worked in the shop for about 8 years now, and just kind of mostly doing all the bow rehairs and repair work that they've got, and have been trying to get more into bow making more seriously since probably 15, 16. Yeah, and I play actually like more like fiddle music, so I deal with a lot of people in that world as well as like the classical and fiddle stuff quite a bit. So yeah, and this is Sarah.
Yeah, I'm from Nashville, Tennessee as well, and worked in a shop for about 7 years, rehairs, repairs, instrument setups, and making out of the house more so these past few years. All been good. Working at a guitar shop now, still making bows on the side.
All right, great. Janelle.
Hi, Hi, I'm Janelle, and I worked at Triangle Strings with Jerry Pasowitz for I think 3 years, and then decided to move out to Portland, Oregon, with my wife, and I make just started making bows these last couple of years, but mostly did instrument and bow repair and restorations. So I also am the liaison for the bow restoration program at Oberlin. And yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Eric, great name.
Yeah. Me, I'm from Quebec in Canada. I'm just from the Canton de Atlee, exactly. And I'm a French guy, so my English is not so good, but it's okay. And
I mispronounced your name then. I'm so sorry. Eric.
Yeah, Eric. Eric. In French. And I started bow making with Lynn Anning like 3 years ago. And I built my own bows since. Yeah, all day long. And my learning, I'm a self-learning, so it's a long process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Vito.
Hi, my name is Vito Vicicaro. I was born in Brazil, and I have a degree. I worked in a steel plant in Brazil. I have a degree in metallurgy, and that was too hard of a life. So I left Brazil for the United States, for the land of gold and ice cream. That was around 1987. In 1994, I took a class on bow making, and since then, there has been many interesting developments. I have in 1997, I founded Arcos Brazil, which is a company that imports and distributes bows made in Brazil. And since then, my time has been divided between bow restoration, bow making, meeting a lot of people around the world. That's what my company actually afforded me to do, is to travel a lot and meet a lot of great folks and make a lot of friends. See a lot of great things and some not so great. Anyways, and this is where I am today, 23 years later. I keep losing the track of time, but I do a lot of bow restoration. I do bow making as much as I can. And I run probably one of the biggest bow distribution companies for student bows made out of Pernambuco wood.
And let's see, last is Zach.
Hey everybody, I'm Zach from Brooklyn, New York. Moved out to New York from Michigan, where I was in school, and I'm originally from New Mexico. And I apprenticed and worked for David Gage out here for 10 years. And about 4 years ago, started my own small shop in Brooklyn. And so I work on a lot of double basses, but studied with Rodney Moore 5 years ago or so and got really into bows and have started making bows, mostly double bass bows, but I've been doing bow work for other shops in the city and getting to see a lot of great bows and doing a lot of restorations, and I love bows, so like learning about it.
And your last name is?
Lane.
Are we long lost brothers?
We might be.
All right, well, good to meet some of you and good to see the others again. I'm just going to share some of the tricks that I have picked up over the years for identifying non-original pieces on a bow and determining what repairs have been done to a bow. Like if I'm at auction, looking over a case of bows, which I often do in Boston for Chris Rooney. I have to make quick judgments on whether this bow has had major repairs or is non-original. That will affect desirability and price. So I've had to look well into the parts of the bow to try and figure out what these guys have done in the past. I'm hoping you guys have a lot to contribute as well. I'm wanting to learn as well. So looking at my notes, why don't we just jump into the hardest thing. Is this frog original to this bow? Why is that the hardest? Because over decades and centuries and a lot of time, a lot of different climates this bow may have been in, there's a lot of potential for movement in every part of the frog and in the handle of the stick itself. So you can look at, say, frog fit. That might be the first thing people look at. Does this frog fit the stick? And it might, but it might not. And it doesn't mean that it is or is not original, whether it fits or not. Handles move quite a bit as they dry out. So a frog that fit perfectly when it was first made probably doesn't fit so well after centuries of the handle expanding in the summertime with the high humidity of the air and then drying out again in the wintertime as the humidity lowers. With that expansion and contraction, the frog fit just doesn't fit so well over time. So what else can you look at? First thing I look at is, does the overall wear on the frog match the handle? If the handle has a lot of cratering, a lot of divots, I would expect to see corresponding wear, especially on the finger side of the frog. What ends up happening on the finger side, let me just grab a frog here. All the wear of the hand that wore down this handle is going to be rubbing against this side of the frog. So I would expect to see a little bit of cratering. Not a lot, just if you put a straight edge on top of it, you might see just a little bit of cratering there. I'd expect to see this edge of the rail here to crater a little bit as well, just from the fingers. Also, that eye right there on the player's side, the finger side, is going to have to be replaced every 10 years or so, probably. So in between replacements, there's going to be a lot of wear to that crisp corner on the frog. The hole, if you looked at the side view, the hole is made with a sharp corner up here that gets worn down as the pearl wears down. That corner becomes exposed and that finger, those fingers there, rub that down. So if I see a frog that does not match the handle wear, that's a red flag. Okay.
Eric, I think we lost just a second. We lost some audio for a second.
Is it working now? I'm not showing a mute.
Okay.
Everyone hear me?
Yeah, it's okay.
So if all that checks out, I'll move on to the next step in the frog. I'll take the frog off and I'll look see where the pins or screws are in the underslide. Over time, because of that expansion and contraction, I would expect the screws to protrude just a little bit. Screws from rust. Pins would extrude a little bit from contraction of the ebony. I note where those are, and then I look on the bottom facet of the stick to see if I see matching scratch lines in the bottom facet of the stick. If they're completely different, then that frog did not make those scratch lines on the bottom facet of the stick. That's a sure sign that it is not original. Because of the handle shrinking a little bit, I would also expect the frog to be ever so slightly wider than the Pernambuco of the stick. If you think the pearl is original, is it the right style of pearl for the frog of the time period? Another thing. Do any of you have any tricks? Of course, you know, stylistically, the frog has to match stylistically. And is this from the same maker? Anything else you guys want to say about frogs?
Eric, I think once in a while, if you can check if some parts of the frogs was replaced also, you know, like
Yeah, we'll get to parts of the frog too. It's just the frog as a whole right now. Just the first thing I wanted to tackle because it's actually the hardest.
I know. I think you covered very well.
There are some pretty clever guys out there who can fit a frog.
Oh, I was just curious if maybe you'll cover this later, just about like the ebony expansion and how sometimes the ferrule is it's tighter than the rails, and that was another thing that I noticed in older frogs, like just to match the age of a frog or to the stick, I guess, is to notice that.
Yeah. I guess that's a good segue. We can move on to the parts of the frog now too. Remember, with the drying out of the ebony, it's going to contract, it's going to shrink, but the silver parts are not going to contract or shrink. That's one reason why the frog at the stick joint, I would expect to see that just slightly wider than the handle, as I said. That silver underslide is not going to shrink. It's going to try and keep the ebony that is trying to shrink. It's going to try and keep it out a little bit. That's how you get a lot of those cracks in the thumb projection. The ebony is shrinking against a silver piece that is not shrinking. Likewise, the ebony is going to shrink in width at the bottom, but your ferrule is not. I'd expect to see that ferrule be between 1 and 2/10 of a millimeter wider than the ebony of the rails right next to it. Likewise, the frog is going to shrink top to bottom. The heel plate's going to stick out on the bottom. The heel doesn't really have anywhere to go up top, so it sticks out the bottom here. The petite talon also will stick out a bit. Now, how do you know if those parts have been replaced? Consistent wear, again, the ferrule, if it's been rehaired 100 times since it was made, you'd expect to see bowing. this way. You'd expect to see tool marks from someone sticking a probe into the wedge to get it out. You'd expect to see some marks on the side of the ferrule from where someone took pliers or a clamp and pulled the ferrule off at some point in the past. Pins also tell me a lot. The pins, as they push out a bit, if they're original, they'll be conical coming out. If they've been replaced, someone has likely put the pin in, bottomed it, and then peened the pin on top just a little bit to fill the hole ever so slightly. So if you look at it carefully from the side, you'll see that the pin, as it comes out of the hole, will flare just a touch. And an original pin would not do that. It would have been seated and then filed flush with the silver. Any questions about frogs so far, Anthony?
Well, or perhaps something to add regarding silver would be, it's a lot easier for me if there's a little bit of tarnish, because if it was a slightly different alloy of silver, even though it's sterling, if the ferrule has a slightly different tinge of tarnish than, let's say, the heel plates, that can be assigned to me that it's not exact.
Absolutely. Even a slightly, ever so slightly different alloy will tarnish differently. Same with pins.
Yeah.
Look at the pins and see if they have tarnished differently as well. I mean, the maker should have used it's likely the maker would have used the exact same alloy for pins, sheet, the rings they made for the buttons, all that good stuff. So if something tarnishes differently, yes, yeah, that would be a red flag, certainly. If we want to move on to button, some of the same things. What I do to determine if button and frog go together, the first thing I look at is pin size. The maker, it's highly unlikely that the maker would have used different pin sizes for these parts. So I go and look at the pin size in the button, compare it to the pins that I can see in the frog, trying to count for any peening that may have been done when it was made. And really the only way to determine that is to look at the hole itself. If they peened in a slightly tapered pin, the hole is going to be slightly tapered as well. If it's a perfectly conical pinhole, then I would expect that pin head to be perfectly flat and cylindrical. I said conical pinhole, I meant cylindrical, pardon me. Cylindrical pinhole, I'd expect the pin to be completely cylindrical coming out. Does the nipple size match mortise in the button? Most of the makers in the past, they would have drilled the hole, cut around with a saw, and then brought the nipple down by hand with a file to the width of the hole in the button. So those are usually a pretty good fit there. You have to account for wear. If they are completely different, look for bushing. See if it's been bushed, or it's just not the original button for the stick. let me see.
What about the type of, let's say, the core, let's go with ebony, that and the frog ebony? Would there be a correlation to the type of ebony in the frog with the ebony in the core? I mean, when I make buttons, I'm not necessarily using ebony from the same, you know, um, source, but I wonder, at least with historical makers, is there going to be a correlation?
Yeah, they should, look the same. They may not be from the same tree, but back then, good ebony was seemingly easier to find than it is now. I've not found obvious differences between button core ebony and frog ebony. Even if it's not from the same tree, it's usually very similar. The difference is not enough to make a determination whether it's an original button and or frog or not. Personally, I keep my button stock and my ebony stock together for that same reason. I want them to match perfectly. I know Matt Whaling at one time told me that he uses a different kind of ebony stock for his buttons, something he thought was a little more rugged and less prone to cracking. But it looks similar enough. I've seen a number of his bows. It looks similar enough. Now, one thing, let me see. If you want to determine if a head plate is original, which I like to keep the head plates original if I can, even if they're cracked but fairly solid, I'll keep an original head plate there just to preserve the look, feel of the bow. And for that, you look at collars. Under magnification, you should see either knife marks or file marks, depending on the maker, and look to see if those file marks continue into the ebony liner of the head plate and into the ivory. Because when those are replaced, no one wants to, a good repair person would not want to touch the marks in the chamfers. So they would just hit the ivory with the file. The mortise will also tell you if it's an original head plate. If you look in it and look at the tool marks inside the mortise. That expansion and contraction too with head plates causes a delineation of the joints between Pernambuco and ebony and ivory. When a bow's brand new, the nice sheen, nice perfect plane going across those three materials that over time will open up a little bit. The ebony usually becomes a little wider than the Pernambuco because the Pernambuco shrinks a little more. So there's some delineation between the three materials that becomes obvious. I have a Thomas Sand up here that I'm working on for the shop, and it unfortunately was pretty butchered. There were large file gouges in the back of the head and the front line of the head. Someone just, in replacing the ivory, just really butchered this head. And when I'm looking at the rest of the bow, I would expect that that person probably did some other work on the bow as well. When this ivory was replaced, it probably needed a rehair. And this person used their skill on bits of on the frog as well with the other repairs. So with this particular bow, it did not have the original frog. All we had was a stick. But if I had the original frog, I'd expect to see, you know, cracked rails, you know, from this guy stuffing a huge spread wedge in it, damage on the ferrule, like that, the plier marks that I mentioned earlier. You know, someone of that skill, person's repairs would have come across on other parts of the bow.
He did such a good work that you don't have a frog at all.
I don't have a frog for that one, no. But the shop had a frog. I'm going to put it on. Unfortunately, the frog is nice, so it's not going to match the bow perfectly. But we're making a functional bow and not trying to fool anyone with this bow.
So Eric, if
Yeah.
I could ask a question, because I'm often faced with this as well. When somebody butchers a head plate like that, and in fact, where I have an EF Bouchard behind me somewhere, where I need to replace the ivory, and someone got into the slight bit of the back chamfer. Do you correct, or how do you correct those mistakes from someone else?
If I can make it look better.
This is what I'm talking about. Like they filed in back in here, and you know, I see this all the time. I think as restorers, most of us do. That's always a judgment call on my part. Where would you comment on correcting someone else's?
Yeah, there's an ethical question on whether you correct past mistakes or if you just accept the history of the bow. I lean more toward respecting the maker's intention a little bit more than the history, the bad history of the bow. If those marks are so deep that I would end up having to remove a lot of material and change the overall look of the bow, then no, I won't do that. In the case of this Thomasan, I was able to remove just a little bit of material, bring the head back to looking respectably like a Thomasan. And I didn't have a problem with that in this case because it just looked so bad. Little teeny marks, I leave those. Generally speaking, you'll find a lot of those in the chamfers and back line. That seemed to be the hardest part for most people to shape. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because
how do you feel about it?
I a similar way. There are times where I've corrected things and made it look as original as possible. And then there's times I had to do a tip ivory on a Grande Dame a few years ago that someone the nose had really filed and lowered the height of the nose, and I left the line on the ivory what it should have been, even though from the top it didn't look right, but there was really very little I could do, short of grafting on wood or something. But you know, as that's something I see all the time. There are people replacing these tips with belt sanders, and I just it's a question that I face quite frequently when doing tip plates, and a lot of times I will correct them as much as I can. Other times there's really nothing to do.
It's really a case-by-case judgment call. It just depends on where your priorities are, really. And for me, I want to respect the maker as best I can. So if I can bring it back to maker's original intention within reason, I'll do that.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
What about, I'm sure that we've all run into this, but when a customer or a boss comes with a bow or something like what Josh was talking about that has the scraping on the back, and they say, I want you to make this disappear so I can try and sell this for the highest value. How would you, I guess, approach the idea of fixing something so that it looks as clean as possible versus holding the maker's intent kind of thing?
If the maker put those marks in it, I would resist changing that. If those marks were the result of someone doing a damaging repair after the bow was made, I'm more inclined to fix that.
Even if it means kind of reshaping something to make it look a lot nicer, though, what I'm saying, for like the client's request, I guess.
I'm hesitant to change anything that was original.
Sure.
Marks, tool marks, anything like that. Thankfully, I'm not put in that sort of situation at my work. Chris Bruning appreciates the originality of the maker's tool marks, and yeah, I just don't have to do stuff like that, thankfully. But original marks, I leave them.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Ready to get on to some repairs? Is this a 1 hour course?
Yeah, I slotted for an hour and 15 minutes. So anywhere from like an hour to an hour and 15 minutes is great. This is great. You're covering a lot of stuff. Super detailed. I think a lot of us are just really thinking about things pretty deeply right now. So this is really great.
Good. I'm not really used to this format. Feels a little awkward to me, but I'm trying to get through it.
Thank you, Eric. This is really good.
Okay, let's go on to some repairs, just things to look for. How about handle grafts? Oh. I have to think about this every time I pull an old bow out of a case, when I'm assessing it for Chris or if I'm at auction. So I compare colors. Color ahead of wrap to color behind wrap, keeping in mind the handle is what gets saturated with sweats and oils. If I'm looking at the wood ahead of the wrap, I'm thinking, okay, well, if this type of wood was saturated with 100 years of sweat and oil, what color would it be? What color would I predict it would be? Then I look at the handle. Does it match my expectation? The next thing I do is I find where the medullary rays pop out ahead of the wrap. So that's your ear angles of Pernambuco. And that ray should be approximately in the exact same position in the handle. If it's off, then that handle has been grafted and the graft is under the wrap. Okay. In addition, pore structure. I look at the pore structure on the stick ahead of the wrap. And when I account for 100+ years of wear on that kind of pore, does it look like the handle? Does the handle look like what I have in mind if I think 100 years of wear and tear on those pores? So then, okay, so if you determine that it was grafted, was the handle grafted or was the stick grafted? Well, the stamp. If there was an original stamp and you think there's a graft under it, then the stick itself has been grafted. More than likely. It is possible that it's a stick from the same maker, but no one has, you know, a ton of broken sartories lying around that they can just Frankenstein back together, unfortunately.
I did see one this year.
Yeah?
Yeah. A Sartori, exactly.
Oh,
So
I've never seen one of those, so cool.
I guess. I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's sad, right? Because, you know, it's somebody trying to pass it off as a real, as a complete thing.
Mhm.
But, yep. You know, people tend to put gold windings on that, so you feel really terrible about taking off a gold winding.
Yeah. And in that case, you have no adjustment of the medullary ray location or gear angle, right?
That's true.
You just, because it's stamped, you can't twist it to match up those medullary rays of the two pieces. So that should have been a little more obvious without taking the wrap off. If you had looked for those medullary rays, there should have been a slight difference.
Eric, do you ever work with somebody that's got an X-ray to it might be more difficult when it's a wire wrap, something like with a tinsel or something. Have you ever done X-ray work on either? No?
No.
Okay.
Does an X-ray, does it show through silver?
That I do not know. I'd like to find that out, but I've seen X-rays of grafted sticks and pinned heads and stuff like that, but I don't know if it works through a silver wrap.
Yeah, I'd want to know that too. I would think it wouldn't. It wouldn't go through, but I do not know.
Yeah, that's the next machine Chris Roening needs to buy is an X-ray machine.
I think I'll just go on the back of a comic book and get those glasses.
Yeah.
You know, the X-ray glasses. I think I'll just they're cheaper.
Yeah, and more useful.
Yeah, I can wear them around town too for, oh, wait, never mind. All right.
You know, you're probably going to cover this, but that's the next, or I guess the brands. You know, is it the original? You know, as far as brands go, that's
that you just have to study and know that some makers use more than one brand. Yeah, I think that's beyond the scope of this talk. Unfortunately, it's just sit down with the Larche books, they're usually pretty good about listing all the different brands and the shops that certain makers worked with. I have a card catalog of all the stamps that I've seen and who worked for those shops and who sold bows to those shops that later got the shop brands, and that's a book in itself right there, really.
Is it possible you could talk about like which makers or what percentage of sticks you see that do have fake brands and that are actually like pretty passable for what they could be? Or do you guys see a lot of that in general, or no?
Most of it is really obvious. And if you know if you know the stamps, it ends up being pretty obvious. For one case in particular, we had a Charles Picot cello bow in the shop that someone had stamped Dodd for some reason. It doesn't make any sense to me why you'd stamp a Charles Picot Dodd, but if you knew the Dodd stamp, it was obvious that it was just those a box of those stamps that someone had DODD on the frog and the stick. A convincing stamp used on a fake bow, that's very rare. It's usually, pretty obvious. And I guess in the past, what unscrupulous dealers may have done, someone writes them, calls them, I'm looking for a such and such bow. And they think, well, what do I have in my inventory that could turn into a such and such bow? And that's probably what happened with this cello bow. Someone was looking for a Dodd because their best friend had one and loved it. And this person said, oh yeah, I've got a perfect Dodd for you. Just give me 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, a convincing stamp is actually quite rare. If
Okay.
you've ever tried to make a stamp yourself, it's got to be exactly perfect to look right. And you can't really tell what this stamp looked like by looking at the stamped wood because of the variables. If it's hot, if it's super hot stamp, it's going to dig in quite a bit. It's going to make the letters look like they were bolder on the stamp than they actually were, for instance. You have no idea how sharp the stamp was. It's rare because it's so hard to do convincingly. I've heard of cases where there were some fake sartories out there that were pretty good. An untrained person, would be fooled by them, but there's something odd about the O in particular. I've heard. I remember Rodney Moore telling this story at Oberlin. He just kept looking at it and saying, "There's something not right. Something not right." And he went back and forth and discovered that the O was just slightly different proportions on this fake. I've not come across that, but that's the most convincing story that I've heard about fake stamps. A lot of this I have on here we've already touched on with the original frog parts. Oh, with even where, kind of going back to that Thomasan that I mentioned with the butchered head, that person also clearly didn't maintain the bow very well. There was a lot of wear on the handle. There was a big old divot from a thumbnail. Okay. I think the last thing to talk about here are grafts and cracks. We've touched on the handle graft a bit, lining up medullary rays. A very crafty restorer would take a lot of time to match the pore directions and medullary rays of the graft to the original piece. A careless restorer if they had a corner graft here, kind of a slightly diagonal piece, you'll find a lot of people will just put in a piece of ebony where the grain lines up with the joint and not the grain of the frog. That should be pretty obvious under magnification. If you look at it, you follow the pores and they aren't all going in the same direction. Look for medullary rays. If you're following the medullary flecking on a frog and it suddenly disappears, going across the frog, it suddenly disappears, not up or down. Look at that area carefully. Could be a graft. Grafts are easier to hide on this face, but if you look at the end grain of frogs, it's almost impossible to hide that joint at end grain. So I always have a loop handy and I'll always look at the end grain as the telltale sign that something has been grafted. If you have a joint that goes kind of vertically in the frog, you'll find that if you follow your pores across the frog, the pores suddenly disappear on one vertical line. Again, a crafty restorer would take something like an X-Acto knife and just cross pores from one piece of ebony to the other, but most people wouldn't either know to do that or wouldn't bother with that. So with that, I think we've covered about everything in my notes. Are there any questions, specifics?
Eric, do you use Blacklight?
Yes. Yes, we do have a UV blacklight in the shop. And I will go take bows that Chris is considering for trade-ins or consignments, things like that. I'll always put it under a blacklight. What the blacklight tells you is usually more subtle than you want it to be. A lot of times what it will tell you is original varnish in a bow and not necessarily a crack in the bow that's been repaired. Usually if I spot something by black light that I did not see under normal light and magnification, it's something having to do with a varnish that has been applied at some point in the past.
Okay.
Or it was original, like a Tubbs bow. I mean, the original varnish is quite obvious.
And do you have any tricks, or do you use any different types of spectrum of lights to like make more evident, like a faded stamp on a bowl? What do you normally do to try to bring some different perspectives on that?
I have not experimented with different spectrums of lighting, but what I do is I will move, say here's my light.
Yeah.
I'll move the stick and the stamp all around the light, hoping that the shadows will give me a hint as to what was originally there. I'll also lick the stamp and do that as well. But really, it's you have to have a knowledge of the stamps. Just finding PARIS at the end, that's not going to narrow it down a whole lot.
Yeah.
But the size of that stamp could.
Sometimes I think I've done it at least once, that there were some remnants of the letters, before the Paris, or sometimes without the Paris, but something I had an idea what it could be. If I have a photo of the correct stamp, I made a sort of a transparency, and I made a print, so I overlap both, see if all the little areas. So I think that's one trick. I always trying to think what can I do to determine, if this is remotely, this maker or that maker.
Yeah, as long as you're careful with the size of the transparency.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. One thing you might try, I've never done this before too, is if you can rub in a paste or something that is something that glows very brightly under UV. You can rub in the stamp,
yes,
and then rub off the high spots, and that might help you figure out what a stamp actually says. Okay. I haven't done that personally, but that could help quite a bit. But the transparency thing, that's very good idea.
Yep.
Any other questions? Eric, are you trying to say something? You're muted.
Trying to unmute you.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
There we go.
You don't talk to the glue using in the frog or the head. Do we have a notice for that, for the glue?
In determining whether something's original or not?
Yeah.
I haven't given that a whole lot of thought. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, back in the day, it would have been all hide glue.
Hide glue, okay.
Hide glue for everything up until, well, let's see. Cyanoacrylate was invented for the Korean conflict, I believe, as a field stitch. Probably wasn't available to consumers until the 60s or 70s, I would think. I remember that commercial where the construction worker gets his hat glued onto the I-beam. Did you guys see that?
Yeah.
That
would have been in the
crazy glue.
I think.
Yeah. I find that did a little bit of research on French furniture making of the 19th century, and they were using also a combination of nerve and bone glue.
Rabbit glue, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbit skin. Yeah.
I think they found that it had the appropriate, adequate strength, to hold furniture basically. So it's possible. I think that some makers use some of
Yeah,
those.
it certainly would have been some sort of organic glue,
Absolutely. Yeah.
whether it's bone or fish or rabbit or
Yeah.
horse or whatever. That's probably basically all they had prior to
Okay.
the 40s and 50s, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else?
So along those lines of glue, like maybe determining like originality of parts. I mean, super glue tends to, like, especially if you're doing like a repair to a frog, a lot of times you'll still see a glue line. Where I think a lot of times some shops prefer to use a hide glue when gluing repairs or doing a graft on the frog. I think Jerry likes to do that, if I'm correct.
So the question is, what do I use when I'm doing these repairs?
Yeah, I mean, or evidence of the types of glue make it obvious if parts have been repaired as well.
That's tricky because a lot of times if something is a little bit loose, people will just run thin CA into any joint. Underslides in particular, you'll just find thin CA in between the underslide and the ebony, caked up down there. Got a loose heel plate, little thin CA will solve everything. It's like the duct tape. Yeah, see? Yep. It's a gap filler too. Thanks,
I think
Josh.
that's pretty legitimate to do, don't you think, Eric? Also,
What was that?
I think that's a legitimate thing to do. There's nothing wrong with it since you're preserving, the material. You're putting everything in less risk of removing, replacing.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's a terrible thing to do. It is sometimes the best thing, but then you can't use the glue itself to determine whether something's been actually repaired or not.
Yes. Well, there's some restorers in the group here, so I don't want them to have the impression that don't use CA on historical bows, because it's like, well, if it does make sense, you don't have to be more intrusive.
Sorry if I implied that. I use CA all the time.
I just had a quick question about, like, if the original screw or eyelet or something like that. Are you ever looking for that? And just any advice about that?
I do. I find original screws and eyelets extremely interesting, but I'd say 95% of the bows over 120 years or so do not have the original screws, and an even higher percentage don't have the original eyelets. I find that, if mechanisms and fits are perfect, you can still probably only get 100 or so years out of an eyelet. The eyelet was designed to wear. That's why it's brass or bronze and the screws are steel, because it is much easier to replace an eyelet. It doesn't seem that way sometimes, but it actually is much easier to replace an eyelet than a screw. So that's why you don't see steel eyelets. They'd wear the screw down. But all that tension, all that rust, all that humidity, it's highly unusual for an old bow to have its original screw still. And because that's such a critical piece of the functionality of the bow, and it's like like the head plates, like the original wrappings. It's great when you have them in their original, but it's not, it doesn't affect the value of the bow for those parts to not be original. Kind of like the tires on a new car. You're expected to
Yeah.
change.
Right.
But it's very interesting. I keep records of the thread pitch and size of screws and eyelets and stuff when I come across them. And I think they're original. I find that very, very interesting.
I think one other aspect when you're looking at the originality of a button to certain makers is that if the rings were done in a martelet or method, or not, some were very consistent with the fitting of the rings, octagonal instead of round. Doing the martelet, basically hammering the rings octagonal and then fitting them to the. So that's one other thing you can look for on originality of a button to a certain makers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you know the maker did that more often than not, yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's just the front ring that's octagonal, so that it doesn't start spinning when they turn the collar. Other times it's both rings depending on the makers. But yeah, that's part of the stylistically knowing what a maker did.
The other thing I think for restorers would be good to have a database of makers that put a tang on their screws and the ones that screw them in, because you can really damage a button if you don't know how to remove it.
Yeah. Well, with the old French guys, it's always one of two things, really. They never screwed them in, the old French guys. That's an English development later. But you will find that sometimes they will stick the screw in the core and peen the back end of the screw to help hold it in.
Yes.
And if you try and pull that screw out with that big peened knob at the end, it's just going to tear things up.
Yeah.
Crack the button, maybe even crack the rings of the button. But yeah, screwing them in, that was an English development. So that would have been not before.
I had to replace the screw on a modern bow. So before I touched it, I called the maker. I said, "What do you do?" And he screwed them in. It's like, oh, very unusual for a modern maker, but I said, okay, good to tell me.
And then you get some guys like David Forbes, who does both of those.
Wow.
He will square the tang and then thread it.
Wow.
And then screw it in. And I think the idea is when you then put glue in, it runs down the flat section and locks the screw into the ebony.
Wow. The maker, I just remember, it was Bill Halsey. I hadn't talked to him in a long time, and it was a good opportunity to call him anyway.
Eric, I had one question. The other day you had a cool post about original windings on, I think it was a winding. And I would imagine there are few lappings that make it through that period of time, but is that something you see a lot of?
You'll find original lappings even less often than you'll find original screws.
Yeah.
The old French guys, more often than not, use tencel and silk wraps. And anyone who's replaced wraps knows that tencel and silk does not last a long time. It's just so much wear from that finger.
Yeah.
on the wrap, and it wears one spot for the most part. And once you wear through that little bit, it all comes undone. So original wraps I find really interesting. I map those things out as well, like what I put on Facebook, you know, the mapping of the
Cool. Yeah.
wrap. Now you'll find that more often, you know, from 1900 on, you'll find original wraps more often, of course. But like an old Picot wrap, it's pretty rare.
I had one other question about replacing underslides and heel plates. Is there any consideration about trying to match pin location of an original maker, or are people replacing those and not using pins so that someone might know that it's been replaced?
No, I put the pins in the same holes as original.
Okay.
I'll sometimes fill the hole a little bit, sometimes with just a little bit of CA. If it's a large pin, then I'll actually turn a dowel. But even if I'm replacing a part, I try and make it look as close to original as I can.
Okay.
If I'm making a frog for a stick, I want to copy the maker's frog as best I can. Sometimes I will stamp the frog on the inside, the hair channel, just so it's not confused for an original.
Cool.
But I'll use that same approach when I'm replacing heel plates or underslides, keeping it as original looking as possible.
I just had a question about the lapping again. Just like, how do you have a technique of telling if it's an original lapping, and do you try to put on the same length and the same wrapping that was there if you're replacing it?
Playability is king, especially in a shop where you have to sell something to eat. So I don't take off original wraps unless they're damaged. But if I have to replace a wrap, I'll replace it with what makes the bow play best. If it has the original wrap and it needs weight, for instance, I'll keep the original wrap and try and find places elsewhere where I can add some weight. Sometimes that could be under a thumb leather, inside a frog, inside a button, changing the screw over to something thicker and heavier. But if I can, I will keep that original wrap. Determining if it's original, you just have to kind of know the materials used for the time period. The Husan that Zachary was talking about, that I mapped and put on Facebook, it actually had the markings on the bottom of it. So it was likely original. It's possible someone could have just copied those markings, but even if they did, it was still very old.
Is that common to see markings on the bow of the original wrap?
It makes things faster, and these guys these guys had to make bows fast in order to eat. You know, so if you've got a little template on a stick or something, and you can just put it on the bow, and then with your chisel just make little markings, and each of those little marks means you change to silk, or change to a combination, or change to tinsel only at that mark. Then as you're doing it, it's much faster than grabbing your ruler, measuring, grabbing your digital calipers and measuring. Okay, 5.2 millimeters. Time to change over. To whatever.
So you've seen that on a lot of bows. It sounds like.
Not a lot. I think a lot of the bows when they are converted to silver, like if they were tinsel originally and they may have had very shallow marks like this, once they're converted to silver and it's been replaced 3 or 4 or 5 times since it was made, it's really hard to see those marks.
Yeah.
Because the silver will make imitations in the Pernambuco at the corners and even on the facets, and those marks tend to get obscured over time. But it's exciting when you do find them. I think I misspoke. I think that was actually a Voirin wrap that I posted on Facebook, even though I did have an original Husan that I posted before that.
So I think we're pretty much at the end of our time for today. Eric, did you have any last thoughts or anything last that you'd like to share or close with?
Be respectful of the maker. Don't try and make something look brand spanking new. Like some of our colleagues do that. I guess that's it. Rodney Moore says, "Thou shalt not do damage." That's a good motto. Just respect the maker.